Welcome to Shadow Storyteller. If you enjoy chilling tales that linger long after bedtime, do not forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Your support helps bring more stories to life. Now, settle in and listen closely. On a frigid December evening in the year 2011, just outside the town of Blackwater Falls, West Virginia, a doll whispered a name no one had spoken in over 60 years. The doll sat perched on a dusty windowsill inside a shuttered farmhouse that leaned slightly to the east, as though burdened by the weight of its own secrets. Its porcelain face was cracked along the left cheek, one glass eye slightly clouded, the other unervingly bright. Its dress, once lavender, now faded to the color of dried lilac, was stitched with tiny, uneven hand-sewn roses that seemed to tremble whenever the wind howled through the trees lining Hollow Creek Road. No one had lived in the house since the late 1940s. Locals called it the Voss Place, named after Amalia Voss, a reclusive seamstress rumored to have buried every memory she couldn't stitch back together. The property had passed through distant relatives and county auctions, but no buyer ever stayed long. Most claimed the air inside felt too still, too watched. Enter Corwin Lavery, a folklorist from Charleston with a penchant for recording oral histories and a voice that sounded like worn flannel. He'd arrived in Blackwater Falls chasing whispers of Appalachian ghost lore, but what he found was far stranger than any campfire tale. It was just past 8 o'clock when Corwin pushed open the rusted gate, his boots crunching on frost-laced gravel. The moon hung low and bloated, casting silver shadows that slithered across the yard. He carried a battered audio recorder, a thermos of strong chicory coffee, and a notebook filled with names like Granny May and Old Man Tiller, folks who'd spoken of a child who vanished one autumn night in 1943, a child whose name, they swore, still echoed from the attic rafters. As Corwin stepped inside the house, the floorboards groaned a protest that sounded almost human. Dust motes swirled in the beam of his flashlight, and the scent of dried rosemary and mildew clung to the air like a secret too heavy to keep. That was when he saw it, the doll. It sat exactly as it had for decades, facing the window as though waiting. He approached slowly, recorder humming softly in his palm. He didn't notice the change at first. But then a whisper. Lysandra. Not loud. Not sharp. Just a breathy murmur, delicate as moth wings against glass. Corwin froze. The name meant nothing to him. He checked his recorder. The red light blinked steadily. He rewound slightly, played it back. There it was again. Unmistakable. Lysandra. His breath caught in his throat. He turned the doll toward him. Its head tilted with a faint creak, as if cooperating. He touched its shoulder, cold, smooth, and felt a shiver race up his arm. Over the next 3 nights, Corwin returned. Each time, the doll whispered the name again, always just after midnight, always in the same soft, sorrowful tone. On the 4th night, a neighbor, an elderly woman named Odelia Cray, knocked on his motel door with a trembling hand and eyes wide with dread. "You best leave that house be," she said, her voice thin as old parchment. That doll belonged to Lysandra Voss. She was Amalia's daughter. Vanished when she was 6. Took her own doll with her, they say. But the doll came back alone. Corwin's pulse quickened. What happened to Lysandra? Odelia hesitated, then lowered her voice. Some say she wandered into the woods chasing fireflies and never made it home. Others say her mother couldn't bear the silence after her husband left, so she folded Lysandra into her stitches and tucked her away where no one could take her again. The next evening, Corwin brought archival records from the Blackwater County Library. Buried in yellowed news clippings was a short notice from October 1943. Local girl, Lysandra Voss, age 6, reported missing. Search parties comb Hollow Creek area. No trace found. But one detail stood out, a photograph. In it, Lysandra wore a dress with hand-sewn lavender roses. The same dress now wrapped around the doll. That night, Corwin returned to the house one last time. He placed the doll on the kitchen table, set his recorder between them, and lit a single candle. The flame flickered, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. "Lysandra," he said gently, "if you're here, tell me what happened." Silence stretched for nearly a full minute. Then, the doll's head turned, slowly, deliberately, until its bright eye locked onto his. And then, not in a whisper, but in a child's clear, trembling voice, "I didn't run away." The recorder captured every syllable. "I was hiding, because Mama said the men with black boots would take me if I made a sound. She sewed my mouth shut with silver thread so I wouldn't cry. But it hurt, oh, it hurt so much, and then I couldn't breathe, and then I wasn't me anymore. Just stitches and silence." Corwin's hands shook as he reached for the doll. Its porcelain surface was warm now, unnaturally so. He lifted it carefully, and heard a faint tearing sound from within its chest. He peeled back the fabric. Beneath layers of cotton stuffing, wrapped in yellowed gauze, was a tiny human finger bone. He dropped the doll. It hit the floor with a sharp crack, and rolled to a stop, staring up at him. The next morning, Corwin filed a report with the local sheriff. The house was sealed. Forensic teams later discovered hidden panels in the attic filled with miniature dresses, each stitched with names of missing children from neighboring counties between 1938 and 1945. All of them girls. All of them vanished without a trace. Amalia Voss had never been charged. She died in her sleep in 1952, clutching a half-finished doll with no face. The doll that whispered, "Lysandra," now rests in a locked evidence box at the West Virginia State Archives. But locals say, on still December nights, if you stand near Hollow Creek Road after midnight, you can hear a chorus of soft voices calling names into the dark. Names like Eloan, Cressida, Maribel, Seraphine, Lois, Lysandra. So tell me, do you still tuck your childhood dolls away in the attic? Or do you keep them close, just in case they remember who you used to be? Weeks after the discovery at the Voss place, Corwin Lavery couldn't sleep. Not truly. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it, that fragile, breathy repetition of names curling like smoke through his dreams. Lysandra, Eloan, Cressida. They weren't just echoes anymore. They were invitations. He tried to move on. Filed his final report with the West Virginia Folklore Preservation Society. Gave a cautious interview to a regional podcast that blurred the facts just enough to keep skeptics scoffing and believers whispering. But something inside him had shifted. The silence now felt louder than sound. Then, in early February of 2012, a package arrived at his Charleston apartment. No return address. Just his name scrawled in looping, old-fashioned script across brown paper worn soft at the edges. Inside was a small wooden box lined with faded lilac silk. And nestled within it, another doll. This one was different. Smaller. Its face was smooth, unmarked, painted with only the faintest suggestion of eyes and lips. Its dress was black wool, trimmed with silver thread that glinted like frost under lamplight. Tied around its wrist was a slip of paper bearing a single name, Seraphine. Corwin's hands trembled as he lifted it. It was lighter than it should have been. Hollow, perhaps. Or waiting. That night, he set up his recorder again, not in some abandoned farmhouse, but in his own living room, surrounded by bookshelves and the hum of city life beyond his window. He placed the doll on his coffee table, lit a single beeswax candle, and pressed record. Nothing happened for over an hour. Then, just after 1 in the morning, the candle flame stretched tall, thin, and blue at its tip. The room temperature dropped sharply. His breath fogged the air. And the doll spoke, Not in a whisper, but in a voice clear and cold as mountain spring water. "I saw what Mama did to Lysandra." Corwin leaned forward, heart hammering. "Who are you?" "Seraphine Belweth. I lived 3 farms over. I was 8 when she took me in during the '39 blizzard. Said my pa was dead from pneumonia, only he wasn't. He came looking 2 weeks later, but by then I wasn't Seraphine anymore. I was thread and stuffing and quiet." The recorder captured every word, crisp and unshaken by static. "She didn't mean to be cruel," the doll continued, its voice softening, almost mournful. "She believed love could be sewn tight enough to keep the world out. She thought if she made us perfect, still, silent, pretty, we'd never be hurt again." Corwin swallowed hard. "Where are the others?" "In the walls. In the floorboards. In the lining of her winter coats. She kept us close. Always." A long pause followed. Then, the doll's head tilted slightly toward the window. "But Lysandra, she was the first. And the only one who tried to come back. That's why her doll speaks loudest. That's why it found you." Corwin spent the next 3 days cross-referencing historical records. Seraphine Bellwether had indeed been reported missing in January of 1939. Her father, Ezra Bellwether, was listed as alive in the next census, confusing officials at the time. A neighbor later claimed Ezra had been seen weeping in his barn for weeks, muttering about a girl who looked like his Seraphine but wouldn't answer to her name. Corwin drove back to Blackwater Falls. The Voss place remained sealed, yellow tape flapping in the wind like cautionary flags. But he didn't need to go inside. He walked the perimeter, following the creek until he reached a grove of skeletal birch trees half buried in snow. There, tucked beneath a mossy stone shaped like a sleeping cat, he found a rusted tin box. Inside were 12 tiny dresses, each hand-stitched, each bearing a name embroidered in silver thread. Beneath them lay a journal, its pages brittle but legible. Amalia Voss's handwriting filled every line, not with confessions, but with lullabies. "I stitch your eyes so you won't see the dark," one entry read. "I stitch your ears so cruel voices can't reach you. I stitch your mouth so no one will ever make you cry. You are safe now, my darlings. You are mine, and I will never let go." The final page was different. Smudged, tear-stained. "They took Lysandra's doll from me today. Said it wasn't right. Said I was sick. But they don't understand. She's still in there. I can feel her breathing through the seams. If I listen closely, she still calls for me." Corwin closed the journal gently, as though tucking a child into bed. He left the box undisturbed, but took one photograph with his phone. The next morning, he contacted a historian specializing in Appalachian domestic tragedies. Together, they began compiling a memorial list of the girls, hoping to give them back their names, if not their bones. But the dolls weren't done. In March, another package arrived, this time at the office of the Blackwater County Historical Society. Inside, a doll in a cornflower blue dress, eyes wide with glassy fear. Its name tag read, Maribel Thorne. That evening, the night guard reported hearing a child's laughter in the empty archives. Security footage showed nothing except the doll, now sitting upright on a desk it hadn't been placed on. By April, news outlets picked up the story. Not the official version, the real one. The one about the whispering dolls and the mother who tried to protect children by turning them into porcelain ghosts. Tourists began showing up on Hollow Creek Road, peering through the Voss Place windows, leaving offerings of ribbons and tiny shoes. But the voices grew stronger. Not just in West Virginia. A woman in Asheville reported her antique doll humming a lullaby in a language she didn't recognize. A boy in Pittsburgh swore his sister's vintage toy called out Eloan in the middle of the night. In a quiet suburb of Cincinnati, A collector opened a recently acquired doll only to find a lock of hair tied with silver thread and a note that read, "She misses you." Corwin realized then, Amalia's work had spread. Her grief had bled into other dolls, other homes, other timelines. She hadn't just preserved her girls, she'd seeded them into the world, hoping someone would finally listen. So he stopped running. He began traveling, not as a folklorist, but as a listener. He visited homes where dolls sat too still on shelves. He carried the original Lysandra doll in a padded case wherever he went. And each time he placed it beside another silent figure, something stirred. Names returned. Memories surfaced. Tears fell on porcelain cheeks. In a farmhouse outside Knoxville, an elderly woman broke down sobbing when the doll whispered, "Cressida." She'd been adopted in 1944, always dreaming of a mother who sang in French and stitched roses into hems. DNA tests later confirmed she was Cressida Lim, daughter of a French seamstress who'd vanished near Charleston during a wartime relocation. In a nursing home in Lexington, a dementia patient reached for the Seraphine doll and suddenly spoke lucidly for the first time in years. "Mama's hands were cold," she murmured, but her thread was warm. Corwin documented it all. Not for fame, not for proof, but because the girls deserved to be remembered, not as victims, but as children who loved dandelions, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. Yet, one question remained unanswered. It wasn't until late autumn, during a storm that rattled the windows of a borrowed cabin in the Monongahela National Forest, that he finally understood. He'd fallen asleep beside the Lysandra doll, exhausted from weeks of travel. In his dream, he stood in a sunlit meadow dotted with wildflowers. A little girl in a lavender dress held his hand. "You hear us," she said simply. "Most people don't. They hear noise. But you hear the silence between the words." He woke with tears on his face, and the doll's head resting against his arm. Now, years later, Corwin no longer lives in cities. He keeps a small cabin near the West Virginia border. His shelves hold dozens of dolls, each with a name, a story, a place in the circle he arranges by the hearth each evening. He talks to them, reads to them. Sometimes they answer. And on the coldest nights of the year, when the wind carries the scent of old roses and damp earth, you can still hear it, if you're quiet enough. A chorus of names, rising like mist from the hollows. Lysandra, Seraphine, Maribel, Eloan, Cressida. Not lost, not forgotten, just waiting to be heard. By the spring of 2014, word of Corwin Lavery's work had spread far beyond Appalachian folklore circles. Not through interviews or documentaries, he refused them all, but through something quieter, more intimate, the dolls themselves. They began appearing on doorsteps, in library return bins, even wrapped in grocery bags left on park benches, always accompanied by a note, a name, and sometimes a single strand of silver thread. People didn't know where to turn when their child's antique doll started humming lullabies in the dead of night, or when a faceless figure they'd inherited from a great-aunt suddenly turned its head toward the moon. Local police dismissed it as overactive imaginations. Psychologists suggested stress or suggestion. But those who lived it, the mothers who found their daughters whispering names they'd never taught them, the collectors who heard footsteps in empty rooms after arranging certain dolls on a shelf, they knew better. And they sought out Corwin. He never asked for payment. Only truth. Only memory. One rain-slicked evening in late May, a battered pickup truck pulled into the gravel drive of his cabin. Out stepped a woman in her late 60s, her silver hair tied back with a faded blue ribbon. She carried a wooden chest bound in iron straps, its surface etched with tiny roses, the same pattern Amalia Voss once stitched into her daughter's dresses. Her name was Mirabelle Hargrove. She'd driven 9 hours from a town so small it barely appeared on maps. Trestle Creek, Kentucky. I found this in my grandmother's attic, she said, voice steady but eyes glistening. She called it the quiet one. Never let anyone touch it. Said it watched. Corwin invited her in. The fire crackled low in the stone hearth. Rain drummed softly on the roof like distant fingers tapping glass. He placed the chest on his work table, unfastened the latch with care. Inside lay a doll unlike any he'd seen before. Its body was made of tightly wound linen, wrapped in layers of fabric that smelled faintly of lavender and candle wax. Its face was smooth, featureless, no eyes, no mouth, yet somehow expressive as if waiting to be given identity. Around its neck hung a pendant carved from bone, inscribed with a single word, "Remember." As Mirabelle watched, Corwin gently lifted the doll. The moment his fingers brushed its chest, the room stilled. Even the rain seemed to pause. Then, from somewhere deep within the linen folds, a voice emerged, not childlike, not whispering, but low, resonant, and weary. "I'm not one girl. I am many." Corwin's breath caught. He'd heard dolls speak before, but never like this. Never with such weight. "Amalia tried to save us one by one," the voice continued. "But grief is not a needle that mends, it is a thread that tangles." When she stitched Lysandra into silence, she unraveled something else. Something older. Something that had been sleeping in the hills long before her sorrow took root. Mirabelle sank into a chair, clutching her shawl. "My grandmother," she said, "the land here remembers everything. Even the things people try to bury." The doll's voice softened. The dolls became vessels. Not just for us, but for what was already here. The weeping women of the mountain paths. The children lost in blizzards before roads were paved. The voices that never made it to paper, to stone, to song. Amalia opened a door. And we walked through, willing or not. Corwin set the doll down slowly. "So you're not just Seraphine, or Lysandra?" "I am all of them," it replied. "And none. I am the echo where names once lived." That night, Mirabelle stayed. Over stew and blackberry tea, she told Corwin about Trestle Creek, a place built over an old mining settlement that vanished overnight in 1892. No fire, no flood, just empty houses, cold stoves, and a single rocking chair still swaying on a porch at dawn. Locals said the mountain had swallowed the town. Others claimed the miners dug too deep and woke something that demanded silence. Her grandmother had kept the doll hidden for 60 years, speaking to it only once a year, on the anniversary of the town's disappearance. She'd say, "Are they still waiting?" And the doll, it would nod. Corwin spent the next week studying regional archives. He cross-referenced disappearances, land deeds, oral histories. Patterns emerged, not just in West Virginia and Kentucky, but across the entire Appalachian spine. Wherever there was deep grief, isolation, or unmarked loss, dolls appeared. Not always porcelain, sometimes corn husk, sometimes cloth, but always bearing silver thread, always carrying a name or the ghost of one. He began to suspect Amalia Voss hadn't started this. She'd simply tapped into a current already flowing beneath the soil, a river of unnamed sorrow that had pooled in the hollows for generations. Her dolls were not the source. They were the signal. By summer, Corwin developed a ritual. Every full moon, he'd gather the dolls in a circle around the fire pit behind his cabin. He'd light sage, pour water from Hollow Creek into a cast iron bowl, and speak each girl's name aloud, clearly, slowly, with reverence. And each time, the air would grow thick with something unseen yet deeply felt, like the hush before a thunderstorm breaks. One July night, as fireflies blinked through the trees and crickets sawed their endless song, something new happened. The Lysandra doll stood, not fell, not rolled, stood on its own, balanced impossibly on the edge of the stone ring. Then, in a voice clearer than ever before, it said, "She's coming back." Corwin froze. Who? The one who walks between. The keeper of the thread. He didn't understand, not then. But the next morning, a letter arrived, hand-delivered by a courier who vanished before Corwin could ask his name. The envelope bore no stamp, only a wax seal imprinted with a rose made of thorns. Inside was a single page of parchment, aged to the color of tea, covered in elegant script that matched the package from 2 years prior. Asterisk, you have listened well, Corwin Lavery. Now it is time to see. Meet me where the creek forgets its name. Bring only the first doll. Come at dusk. Do not speak on the path. And whatever you do, do not look behind you until I say so. Asterisk. The signature was a single initial. Emilia. Impossible, of course. She'd been dead for over 60 years. Yet Corwin felt no fear, only a strange, aching certainty that this was always where the path led. At sunset he walked, the doll tucked inside his coat, warm against his chest. The trail to Hollow Creek twisted through ancient oaks, their branches weaving a canopy that swallowed the last light. The air grew colder with every step, though summer still bloomed in the fields below. He reached the bend where the creek narrows and curves so sharply it seems to double back on itself. The locals called it the Whisper Turn. There, beneath a weeping willow draped in moss, stood a woman. She wore a dress of faded lavender, her silver hair braided with dried roses. Her hands were clasped before her, fingers long and slender, stained faintly with indigo and rust, the marks of a lifetime spent with needle and thread. She did not smile, but her eyes, deep, sorrowful, knowing, held no malice. "You return them their voices," she said. Her voice was like dry leaves over stone. "That was never my intent. I only wanted to keep them safe." "Silence isn't safety," Corwin replied gently. "It's another kind of loss." Emilia looked down at her hands. "I was so afraid of the world taking them. I took them from the world myself." For a long moment, neither spoke. The creek murmured over smooth stones. A nightjar called from the trees. Then she lifted her gaze. "You may keep Lysandra. She chose you. But the others, they must return to the earth. Their time in stitches is done." She reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew a spool of silver thread, gleaming faintly in the twilight. "This thread binds more than fabric," she said. "It binds memory to place. When you bury the dolls with their names spoken aloud, their stories will seep into the roots, the streams, the wind. They will become part of the land that loved them first." Corwin nodded. "And you?" Emilia smiled then, a sad, fragile thing. "I am the keeper. As long as one name is remembered, I remain. But when the last doll is laid to rest, I will finally sow my own silence." She turned to leave, her form already fading like mist at dawn. "Wait," Corwin called softly. "Why me?" She paused, half-turned, her silhouette blurred at the edges. "Because you hear the spaces between the words," she said. "And that is where we live." Then she was gone. The next morning, Corwin began the journey back to every home, every archive, every museum that held one of the dolls. One by one, he returned them, not to shelves, but to the earth. Beneath oak trees, beside forgotten graveyards, at the mouths of creeks where children once played. Each burial was simple. A name spoken 3 times. A handful of soil. A sprig of rosemary. And every time, the wind would lift just after, carrying the faintest echo of laughter, or perhaps relief. Years have passed now. Corwin still lives in his cabin, though he's older, his hair more gray than brown. The Lysandra doll sits on his windowsill, facing east, toward the rising sun, not the shadows. It no longer speaks, but sometimes, on the clearest mornings, its porcelain cheek catches the light in a way that looks like a smile. And if you walk the paths near Hollow Creek after dark, you might hear something strange, not whispers, not names, but something softer. The sound of tiny stitches, slowly, gently, being undone. The autumn of 2017 arrived with a hush unusual even for the hollows. The leaves fell earlier than usual, crimson and gold tumbling like embers from the trees, and the wind carried a scent not of wood smoke or damp earth, but of old paper and dried lavender. Locals in Blackwater Falls spoke in lowered voices about the quiet season, a time when radios crackled for no reason, mirrors fogged without breath, and children refused to play near the creek after dusk. Corwin noticed it first in his dreams. He no longer saw meadows or mist-laced hills. Instead, he walked endless hallways lined with doors, each one small, child-sized, each marked with a name stitched in silver thread. Lysandra, Seraphine, Maribel. Behind some doors, he heard humming. Behind others, silence so deep it ached. But one door stood slightly ajar at the very end of the corridor, its nameplate blank. He woke each time with the same sensation, the ghost of a small hand brushing his wrist. Then, on the night of the hunter's moon, the Lysandra doll moved again. Not dramatically, not with fanfare. But when Corwin poured his morning coffee, he found it sitting not on the windowsill, but on the kitchen table, facing a second chair he hadn't used in years. Its cracked cheek caught the dawn light, and for the first time since he'd met it, Corwin felt not curiosity, but invitation. That afternoon, while sorting through old field notes, he discovered something he'd overlooked. A map tucked inside the back cover of Amalia's journal. Not a drawing of roads or property lines, but a series of symbols, circles within circles, branching lines like roots, and at the center, a single word in faded ink, Valewood. He'd assumed it was metaphorical. But when he cross-referenced land surveys from the 1930s, he found it a narrow, wooded ravine deep in the Monongahela National Forest, marked only as uninhabitable and geologically unstable. No trails led there. No maps acknowledged it. But local legend called it Vale Hollow, a place where time slipped and voices from other days wandered freely. 2 days later, Corwin packed a satchel, water, bread, his recorder, and the Lysandra doll wrapped in lilac cloth, and set out. The forest swallowed him quickly. Ancient hemlocks closed ranks overhead, dimming the world into twilight by midday. Moss muffled his footsteps. The air grew thick, sweet, and cool, like the inside of an old wardrobe. He followed a deer path that twisted unnaturally, doubling back on itself in ways that defied compass logic. Once, he passed the same lightning-struck oak 3 times, each time with fewer branches. Then he saw it. A grove. Not large, perhaps 30 paces across, but enclosed by a ring of standing stones, each no taller than a child's shoulder. Between them, vines of moonflower bloomed white in the gloom. At the center stood a single weeping willow, its branches trailing into a still, black pool that reflected no sky, no trees, only endless dark. Corwin approached slowly. The Lysandra doll grew warm in his arms. As he stepped across the threshold of stones, the world changed. The air hummed, not with insects or wind, but with presence. And then, shadows detached from the trees. Not menacing, not threatening, just that girls in dresses of every era, 30s gingham, 40s wool, 50s cotton, stood watching him with calm, knowing eyes. Lysandra was among them, barefoot, her hair loose, her smile small but real. Seraphine held Maribel's hand. Cressida leaned against the willow, idly braiding a stem of silver thread. "You brought her back," Lysandra said. Her voice was no longer a whisper, but strong, clear, alive. I didn't know I was supposed to, Corwin replied, heart full. This is where we go when the stitches come undone, Seraphine explained. Not heaven, not earth, just between. A place to rest before the stories carry us home. Corwin looked around. Is this real? It's as real as memory, Lysandra said. As real as love that refused to let go. He spent hours there, though time felt fluid, meaningless. The girls showed him things. How the pool reflected not faces, but moments. Lysandra chasing fireflies, Seraphine reading under a quilt, Maribel dancing in a sunlit kitchen. They weren't ghosts. They were echoes given form by grief that had finally learned to release. Before he left, Lysandra pressed something into his palm, a tiny needle made of bone, threaded with silver. For the next listener, she said, when the world grows loud again, and someone needs to hear the quiet. He stepped back through the stones at dusk. The forest welcomed him like a sigh. And though the grove vanished behind him, he knew it was still there, waiting for those who knew how to listen. Back at his cabin, Corwin placed the bone needle on his desk beside Amalia's journal. He didn't speak of Valewood. Not yet. Some truths are too fragile for words. But the dolls kept coming. Not in packages now. They appeared in dreams, in reflections, in the space between heartbeats. And each time, they carried a new name, girls from places far beyond Appalachia. A child from a flooded town in Louisiana. A little boy from a Dust Bowl settlement in Oklahoma. A twin from a vanished logging camp in Oregon. The thread had spread. The river of quiet sorrow was wider than he'd imagined. He began to understand. Amalia hadn't been alone in her grief. She'd just been the first to stitch it into something tangible. Across America, in every corner where loss went unspoken, people had done the same, clutching dolls, letters, shoes, locks of hair, trying to hold on to what the world had taken too soon. So Corwin changed his purpose. He stopped seeking answers. He started building bridges. He wrote letters, not for publication, but for those who wrote to him in trembling script, describing dolls that turned toward the window at midnight, or nursery rhymes sung in unfamiliar accents. He mailed seeds from the willow near Hollow Creek, with instructions to plant them where silence lives. He taught others the ritual, speak the name 3 times. Pour water. Let go. Slowly, reports began to shift. Not of fear, but of peace. A woman in Maine buried a doll that had whispered her grandmother's childhood nickname, and the nightmares stopped. A man in Texas placed a cornhusk figure beneath an oak after hearing it murmur his sister's name, and for the first time in 40 years, he cried without shame. In a small town in Nebraska, a teacher found a doll in the school attic that spoke a name from the 1870s. The community held a memorial, and the local creek, long called Dry Run, began flowing again that spring. The phenomenon had a name now, whispered in online forums and late-night radio shows. The Listening. And Corwin Lavery, once a folklorist chasing ghost stories, had become its quiet steward. But the blank door in his dreams remained. One winter night in 2019, as snow blanketed the hills and the fire burned low, the Lysandra doll turned its head toward the hearth, not at Corwin, but at the shadows pooling near the mantel. A new voice spoke. Not from the doll. From the room itself. You've done well, Corwin. He knew that voice. Older. Weird. Infinitely sad. Amalia. She stepped from the dark, not as a ghost, but as a woman woven from memory and mist. Her hands were empty now. No needle. No thread. The last doll has been laid to rest, she said softly. In Oregon, yesterday. A boy named Eli. His doll spoke only once, his mother's lullaby. Then it crumbled to dust. Corwin rose slowly. Does that mean it's over? It means the river has reached the sea, she replied. The names are no longer lost. They are carried. In stories. In soil. In song. She looked at the Lysandra doll. She may stay with you. Not as a vessel, but as a friend. Then she turned to Corwin. And you may walk the Valewood anytime you wish. The door is open. Why? He asked. Why me? Because you never tried to own the silence, she said. You only gave it space to speak. She faded like breath on glass. The next morning, Corwin placed the bone needle inside Amalia's journal and closed it for the last time. He walked to the edge of his property, where the trees grew thickest, and whispered a single word into the wind, Valewood. The air shimmered. The path appeared. He didn't take it that day. But he knew he would again. Because the work wasn't done. It never truly is. For as long as there are names forgotten, children lost, and hearts that ache in the quiet, someone must listen. And somewhere, in a cabin nestled in the hills of West Virginia, a doll with a cracked cheek watches the sunrise, no longer waiting but remembering. And that, perhaps, is the truest kind of peace. By the summer of 2022, Corwin Lavery's cabin had become something of a quiet pilgrimage site, not for tourists, but for those who carried silence in their bones. They came from as far as Maine and California, often with nothing but a worn suitcase, a photograph, or a small cloth bundle containing a doll that no longer spoke but still felt heavy. They never knocked. They simply stood at the edge of the clearing until Corwin saw them through the window and nodded them inside. He no longer asked their stories. He waited for the stories to ask for them. One humid July afternoon, as cicadas buzzed in the oaks and the creek murmured its endless song, a teenager arrived. She couldn't have been older than 16, with wild auburn hair and eyes that darted like startled birds. She carried a canvas tote bag slung over one shoulder, its strap frayed, its contents clinking softly with every step. She stopped just beyond the porch and didn't move for nearly 10 minutes. Corwin finally stepped outside, barefoot, holding 2 glasses of sweet tea. He set one on the railing and leaned against a post, giving her space. "My name's Corwin," he said simply. The girl swallowed. "Iris," she whispered. "Iris Vale." She reached into her bag and pulled out a doll. Not porcelain, not antique, but handmade from muslin and wool, its face stitched with clumsy love. One eye was a button, the other missing. Its dress was patched from what looked like an old flannel shirt. "It belonged to my sister," she said, voice trembling. "Wren. She disappeared last winter. Near Harper's Ferry. They said she ran away. But I found this in her backpack the day before she vanished. And last week, it started humming." Corwin didn't react. He just nodded. "The humming, it's a tune our grandma used to sing. Only Wren and I knew it. No one else." She looked up, tears welling. "Does that mean she's one of them?" Corwin walked down the steps slowly, stopping a few feet away. "The dolls don't choose the lost, Iris. They choose the listeners. And you've been listening longer than you know." He invited her in. That night, as fireflies drifted through the open windows and the Lysandra doll sat quietly on the shelf, Corwin taught Iris the ritual. Not the burial. There was no body, no confirmation, but the calling. "Speak her name," he said. "Not to summon. Not to demand. Just to say, I remember you." They walked to the creek under a sky thick with stars. Iris knelt on the mossy bank, held the doll close, and whispered, "Wren Vale." Twice. 3 times. On the third, the creek stilled. Not frozen, just paused. The water smoothed into glass. And in its surface, for only a heartbeat, a reflection appeared, not Iris, not Corwin, but a girl with the same auburn hair, wearing a flannel dress, smiling softly. Then the water rippled and it was gone. Iris didn't cry. She exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for months. "She's okay," she murmured. "'Tis somewhere loved." Corwin placed a hand on her shoulder. "Some people don't vanish, Iris. They're just waiting to be remembered in the right way." Iris stayed for 3 weeks. She helped Corwin tend his herb garden, repaired the cabin's sagging porch step, and learned to stitch properly, not to bind, he told her, but to mend. On her last night, she left the doll on the hearth, wrapped in a square of lilac fabric. "I don't need to keep her close anymore," she said. "I carry her here." She touched her chest. When she left at dawn, the Lysandra doll turned its head to watch her go. That autumn, letters began arriving with a new kind of handwriting, younger, hopeful, less afraid. School teachers wrote about students who'd drawn dolls in their journals and heard names in their dreams. Librarians reported children checking out folklore books and returning them with notes tucked inside. Asterisk, "Tell Corwin thank you." Asterisk, a high school in Asheville even started a listening project, where students recorded oral histories of local losses and planted moonflower seeds at memorial sites. The silence was no longer something to fear. It was becoming a language. But Corwin sensed a shift, not in the world, but in himself. His hands trembled more in the cold. His dreams grew longer, deeper. And more often than not, when he walked the forest, he found himself standing at the edge of Valewood without meaning to. The standing stones welcomed him now. The girls waved like old friends. Lysandra would run ahead, barefoot through the moonflowers, calling, "Hurry, Corwin! There's someone new." One crisp November morning, the air sharp with the promise of snow, he woke to find the bone needle glowing faintly on his desk. Not with light, but with warmth, like sunlight held in stone. He knew what it meant. That evening, he packed a small satchel, dried apples, a wool blanket, his recorder, though he doubted he'd need it, and the Lysandra doll, now wrapped in a shawl woven by Iris. He didn't leave a note. There was no one to explain to. He walked to Valewood as the first stars blinked awake. The stones hummed as he passed through. The willow bowed its branches in greeting. And waiting beneath it, hand in hand, were Lysandra and a girl Corwin had never seen before, tall, with windswept hair and eyes full of quiet strength. "This is Amalia's daughter," Lysandra said gently. "The real one." The girl stepped forward. "You thought I was Lysandra," she said, "but I was never lost. I chose to stay, to guide the others home." Corwin understood then. Amalia's grief had been so vast, so consuming, that her daughter's spirit had folded into it, becoming the voice of all the lost, so no one would be alone. "I'm ready," the girl said, smiling. "The last thread is cut." She took Corwin's hand. It was warm. "Will you walk with us?" she asked. Not as a listener, but as a keeper. He looked back once, at the world of rustling leaves and distant roads, of radios and rain and sweet tea on summer porches. Then he turned toward the pool. As his foot touched the water's edge, the Lysandra doll in his satchel dissolved into petals and thread, drifting upward like fireflies. And the creek behind him, for the first time in decades, sang a new name, not in sorrow, but in farewell. Years later, hikers sometimes find the cabin empty but tidy, the fire laid but unlit, a single lilac dress folded on the windowsill. They say if you sit quietly on the porch at dusk, you can hear two voices, the older, gentle and worn, the younger, bright and clear, telling stories to the wind. And if you listen closely enough, the wind tells them back. Not as ghosts, but as guardians. For the lost are never gone. They are only waiting to be remembered well. And somewhere beyond the stones, beneath a willow that blooms silver in the moonlight, a new listener sits with a needle and thread, not to silence grief, but to stitch it into something beautiful. Something that lasts. Something that sings. Spring returned to Blackwater Falls in 2025 not with fanfare, but with a softness that felt like forgiveness. The snow melted quietly into the creek, the trilliums pushed through damp soil in clusters of white and blush, and the old cabin, still standing, still waiting, began to hum again, not with voices, but with presence. It wasn't haunted. It was tended. No one knew who first left the offering. But by March, the porch held a growing collection. A child's red mitten, a hand-stitched quilt square bearing the name Eloan, a tiny bottle filled with creek water and moonflower petals, and a music box that played a lullaby no one recognized yet somehow remembered in their bones. Locals stopped calling it the Voss Place or Lavery's Cabin. They simply said, the Listening House. And then, on a mist-laced morning in early April, a letter arrived, not in the mailbox, but tucked beneath the lilac dress on the windowsill. The paper was thick, cream-colored, sealed with wax imprinted not with a rose, but with a crescent moon cradling a needle. Inside, written in careful script that shimmered faintly, as if inked with crushed starlight, was a single invitation. Asterisk, the valewood blooms anew. Come at moonrise. Bring no satchel. Bring no name. Come as you are remembered. Asterisk. There was no signature. But Corwin would have known that handwriting anywhere. He hadn't walked the path in over 2 years. Not since the night he'd stepped into the pool and felt the world dissolve into song. He'd returned, changed, quieter, but never gone back. Not until now. As twilight fell, he walked alone. The forest greeted him like an old friend. The deer didn't flee. The owls called his name in soft hoots. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as he crossed the ring of standing stones. Valewood was different. The willow's branches shimmered with silver leaves that glowed without light. The black pool reflected not darkness, but constellations unseen from earth, spirals of sapphire and gold, rivers of white fire. And gathered beneath the tree were not just the girls he'd known, but dozens more, some in pioneer bonnets, others in flapper dresses, some in modern hoodies and jeans. All ages, all eras, all smiling. At the center stood Lysandra, or the girl who had worn her name like a lantern. "You're not leaving again, are you?" she asked, though her eyes held no sadness, only knowing. "No," Corwin said. "I think I'm finally arriving." She nodded. The river needed a guide. Now it has thousands. The silence needed a voice. Now it has songs. From behind the willow stepped a figure Corwin hadn't seen in years, Amalia Voss. Not as a ghost, not as a weeping mother, but as she might have been in life, strong-shouldered, clear-eyed, hands steady, wearing a simple dress embroidered with all the names she'd once tried to keep. "I was wrong," she said, her voice warm as hearth smoke. "Love isn't about holding tight. It's about letting go and trusting the world to remember." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, unmarked doll. Its face blank, its dress plain. "This is for the next chapter." She handed it to Corwin. The moment his fingers touched the fabric, warmth spread through his chest, and 1,000 whispers brushed his mind. Not names, but feelings. Comfort, courage, curiosity. "This one doesn't speak a single name," Lysandra explained. "It carries the space between them, the quiet where new stories begin." Corwin understood. His role wasn't to end the cycle, but to hand it forward. When he returned to the cabin just before dawn, the first light catching in the dew-heavy grass, he found a young woman waiting on the porch. She couldn't have been older than 20, with dark braids and a satchel covered in embroidered moons. She held a recorder in one hand and a notebook in the other. "My name is Marlowe," she said, rising. "I've been listening to your stories since I was 10. I'm a student of oral tradition at West Virginia University. I don't know why I'm here, but I heard the creek call my name last night." Corwin smiled. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't need to. He stepped inside, returned with the blank-faced doll, and placed it gently in her hands. "It doesn't belong to me anymore," he said. "It belongs to the next listener." Marlowe's eyes widened as the doll warmed against her palms. "What do I do?" "Nothing," Corwin said. "Just be still. Be kind. And when someone comes carrying silence, don't try to fix it. Just sit with them in it. That's where the healing begins." Over the next weeks, Marlowe stayed. She cataloged the offerings on the porch, transcribed the lullaby from the music box, and began recording the stories locals brought, not as folklore, but as living memory. She planted moonflowers along the creek bank and taught schoolchildren how to stitch names into fabric without fear. And slowly, the cabin's heartbeat shifted from one keeper to another. Corwin didn't vanish. He simply stepped back, into the woods, into the quiet, into the role of elder witness. He still walked the path to Valewood on moonlit nights, but now he went not to guide, but to visit. To sit beneath the silver willow with Lysandra and Amalia and the ever-growing circle of remembered souls, sharing stories like bread broken at a long table. One evening in late October, as the hills blazed in red and gold, Marlowe found him on the porch, wrapped in a quilt, watching the fireflies rise. "Do they still speak to you?" she asked softly. "Not in words," he said, "but in the way the creek bends, in the shape of shadows at dusk, in the hush before a child laughs. They're in the world now, not trapped in it." She sat beside him. "What happens when I'm gone? Who listens then?" Corwin looked at the stars beginning to pierce the violet sky. "Someone always does. The silence never stays silent for long. It just waits for a kind ear." That winter, the first snow fell on the solstice. By morning, the listening house wore a crown of white, and the porch held a new offering, a child's drawing of a girl holding hands with a willow tree, labeled in crayon, "My sister is safe." Marlowe pinned it to the cabin wall, beside Amalia's journal and Corwin's old recorder. And in the attic, where dust once ruled and secrets festered, the air now smelled of dried lavender and beeswax candles. On a wooden shelf, arranged with care, sat a row of small figures, corn husk, porcelain, cloth, each bearing a name stitched in silver thread. Not as relics, not as warnings, but as reminders. For the lost are never truly gone. They live in the hush between heartbeats, in the pause before a name is spoken, in the courage of those who dare to listen. And somewhere, beyond the stones and stars, beneath a silver willow that blooms even in winter, a circle gathers, not in sorrow, but in song. A song that began with a whisper, and will echo as long as someone is willing to hear it. But on the longest night of 2025, December 21st, when the moon refused to rise and the wind carried no sound at all, Marlowe woke to a knock at the cabin door. Not a hesitant tap, not a lost traveler's plea. 3 slow, precise raps, like knuckles on bone. She opened the door to an empty porch, snow untouched except for a single set of tiny footprints leading away into the trees. At her feet lay the blank-faced doll Corwin had given her. Its plain cotton dress was now stained dark, wet with something that smelled faintly of iron and old roses. And its face was no longer blank. 2 glass eyes, clouded with age, stared up at her. A stitched mouth curved into a smile too wide, too knowing. That night, the recorder on the kitchen table clicked on by itself. No hand touched it. No voice spoke. Yet for exactly 6 minutes and 17 seconds, the moment Lysandra Voss was last seen alive in 1943, it captured only one sound: the soft, rhythmic pull of a needle through skin. By dawn, Marlowe was gone. The cabin stood undisturbed. Her notebook lay open on the desk, the last entry unfinished. Asterisk, the dolls don't just carry names, They make room for new ones. And on the windowsill, beside the lilac dress, sat two dolls now. One old, one new. The new one wore Marlowe's favorite sweater, shrunk, stitched, and stuffed with dried creek moss. Its head turned slowly as the first pale light touched the glass. And from deep within its chest, barely audible, came a whisper, not of fear, but of invitation. Come listen,